Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Family Treehouse, a podcast series brought to you by Storied, where I chat with people who have a passion for genealogy, storytelling, or both. I'm your host, Heather Honert, and I am so delighted today. We have a super special guest on our show, Suzanne Russo Adams. Suzanne, I have to read all of these credentials because they're amazing, and I know I'll forget them, so I've got them written down. Suzanne is an associate professor of history and director of the Center for Family History and Genealogy at BYU. I said, I think that's an awesome gig. She has degrees in family history, genealogy, sociology, and history. She's also an accredited genealogist professional in Italy. Super cool. And to me, what makes Suzanne's perspective so valuable today on the show is just her extensive industry experience. She was nearly 12 years at Ancestry working on strategy and content digitization, followed by 13 years at FamilySearch as a senior content strategist overseeing record acquisition across mobile global regions. Like your resume is impressive. Welcome, Suzanne.
Thanks. It's good to be here. I'm excited to talk to you.
Yeah, and I just have to know a little bit more. So an accredited genealogist professional in Italy. So what does that look like?
So this kind of goes to my origin story, I suppose, because I'm half Italian on my father's side. And when I came to school at BYU, I should probably even back up. So I was kind of the kid, um, when I was younger, I actually loved to hear the stories. And so we would have these big Italian family gatherings on Sundays or, for holidays and things like that. And oftentimes I was the kid that was sitting around with the adults just listening to their stories. And I was super fascinated by hearing those stories or hearing the language because my grandparents spoke Sicilian and many of the older generations spoke Sicilian. And so I just love to just sit there and hear kind of the stories of the old country. I wasn't admittedly super interested in family history, the names, the dates, the places, that kind of thing. I just love to hear the stories. And my cousins or my siblings would be like, Suzanne, come play with us, come play with us. And I'm like, no, I gotta hear the rest of this story. This is like intriguing to me. And so it kind of, I think, started when I was younger that I just loved to hear the stories.
Yeah.
And when I came to school at BYU, I had no clue what I wanted to do with my life, and I started studying sociology and other things. And then I discovered that there was an intro class on family history, and I just decided I really wanted to know more about my Italian ancestry. And so it kind of just started from taking that beginning class. And there was a professor here at BYU, George Camp, who did a lot with Spain and Southern Europe. And so I discovered there was a major in family history, and I changed my major and started studying with him, started studying more of the language. I had even in junior high taken Latin and remember coming home and telling my parents, what am I going to do with Latin in my life? Well, fast forward to BYU, and it was an Italian records and church records and, just even across the globe, the relevance of that. And so,
Yeah.
so for me, it did start with the stories, but then it came, I feel like I'm a little full circle here at BYU because I began here and I'm sort of ended up here. Uh, but yeah, I love it. And that, yeah, it came really from my father's side being all Italian.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how many have you been a lot of times to Italy to do
Yeah,
research?
I have. I've had the opportunity to go several times. Even as a student here at BYU, I did an internship mainly working in the State Archive of Naples in Italy. And then my family comes from Sicily, so I had lots of opportunities to go to Sicily and do research and then go back with especially at my time at Family Search, multiple times. I helped with the acquisition of vital records and other documents in Italy. So it's a lot of fun.
That's incredible.
Yeah,
Great,
yeah.
great story. And I think I always enjoy hearing everybody's. I love how you said it, your origin story. I love that's one of my favorite things that we talk about first on this show. And I find that most people were bitten by that bug very early, as children and hearing those stories. So that's great.
Yeah.
Suzanne, why do you think storytelling is just such an important part of family history?
Oh my goodness. I think because we all relate to stories, I think there's something that um just even as little children or just as adults that we love to hear. Um or maybe it's just because as a family historian, I'm professionally nosy, maybe that too. I just love to learn about people. And
Yeah,
I think that's also one of the things that drew me to family history is learning more about people, whether they be living or dead,
yeah,
and kind of what motivates them too. I think that's for me, that's one of the things that why I think it's so important. It's one thing, and I tell my students all the time, it's one thing to gather up the records, and we're so blessed to have so much online. And I've been, through my career, been a huge part of that. I was actually hired at Ancestry as the first person to write instructions on how to index data. At the
wow.
time, Ancestry was super small, about 50 to 75 employees, and just getting started putting things up online. Well, I think it's been a huge blessing that so much is online, but I feel like a lot of times people are like, oh, I'm just going to gather the records and less apt to kind of dig into those documents and tell the stories. And so one of the things I love to do is timeline because I
Yeah,
think that shows,
yeah,
where they were at a certain place and a certain time and history too, the context
yes,
of
yes,
knowing,
yes.
why did they move to this place or what were they doing or what were their motivations? I don't know if that answered your question,
No,
but
that's perfect. Yeah. And I love the idea of the timeline. And I've actually recently been doing a lot with um, I guess the person's timeline, not so much the historical, like the year, but a
hmm
person's timeline. And I've really been looking at, direct line ancestors and kind of putting their timeline over top of each other,
yeah.
females in particular, because you can see so many similarities, I think, in
hmm
families by doing that. So huge advocate for the timeline. I love that. And historical context for sure.
Oh yeah, yeah. Gotta have that
That's my rabbit hole.
too.
I get down that.
Yeah. Well, and the laws too. Just understanding the context of what was happening at the time, historical, legal, all those sorts of things play into, maybe why they moved somewhere, or opportunities, or just different things like that. So yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I love this next question, just thinking about it from your perspective, being
hmm
at the university, and what are some things, resources, or tools that you tell your students or recommend to your students, especially starting out? And it could be anybody, it doesn't have to just be a student. I
Yeah.
think we find a lot of people coming into Storied have never done any kind of family history before. So, what are some tools or resources that you suggest?
Yeah, I mean, Storied is obviously a go-to, right? Um, I think if you're talking specifically the stories, the newspapers are just fun and fascinating. You obviously start with yourself when you're doing family history, but as you move backwards, some of that historical context, some of those stories can come out of researching in newspapers. It's one thing to go and, like I said, gather like the censuses and the vital records. It's I would say getting kind of beyond that. Those are so
Mhm.
easy to find now.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
so getting beyond that, kind of figuring out, filling in the cracks, filling in the
Yes.
gaps.
Yeah.
Censuses were taken what, every 10 years, and if you're
Right.
lucky, you get a state census in there somewhere, but filling in those gaps and those cracks. So I think obviously Storied is a good place to go. Ancestry, Family Search, those are kind of the big names in town, right? And
Yeah.
have really great resources for your censuses and your vitals. But newspapers and actually, I'm going to say city directories too.
Yes.
'Cause those are kind of fun. I show some examples in classes where you can see people family members living together across time, and then, kind of I've even in newspapers or in city directories just plugged in the address. So
Mhm.
there's one little tip. You just plug in the address and the keyword, and you can kind of see across time who was living in one location. And
Yes.
oftentimes it's family members, right?
Yes. Yeah, for sure. You are a girl after my own heart. Newspapers and city directories are two of my
It's
favorites.
just fun.
And, I just love newspapers, like you said. I think that concept of just filling in the cracks, I
Mhm.
think about a marriage certificate, for example, is not going to be nearly as robust as maybe a newspaper article that tells what they were wearing, what they had to
Yeah.
eat, those kinds
Yeah,
of things.
and the US, I think, especially has a rich, rich history of newspapers. You see it
Yes.
less so, across the globe, but in places like, the US or even England or Australia, you've got Trove there. Um, just, just an amazing history of
Yeah.
newspapers. And what I love about it is you get the small town details, but you get the big picture too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I love this question. This is a fairly new one to the show, and I love asking people if you could meet one ancestor in
Mm.
person, only one,
Okay.
who would it be, and would you ask them anything specific?
Okay, this is a very hard one. This is a difficult question, but I would probably say my great grandmother Rose Nagley. And if you'll bear with me, I'll tell you a little bit about her. But she
Yes.
was born in Switzerland in 1886.
Okay.
And as a young child, she was youngest of like 12 children.
Yeah.
And they they were from Hasselberg in Bern area, but moved to Zurich for work and met some missionaries from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And so she was just as a tiny child, her family joined the church, and then the missionaries who converted them actually took her with them to Utah. She was, I think, around 4 years old. So you see her, I know, separated from her family, 4 years old. Um, this Dot Weller, they were also from Switzerland. So she comes across 1891, 4 year old, ends up in Logan, Utah, and uh that family couldn't take care of her, so she was adopted by a McNeil family. So you can imagine her name in records is Nagley, Datwiller, McNeil, and then 1911 she meets my great grandfather, and they marry and start having children. He had actually been married before and lost his wife, sadly. Um, but they married, started having kids, and they lived in Utah, then they lived in Idaho, and he was sick, so they moved to Arizona. And so my grandfather was born, he was the youngest, much like her, she was the youngest in her family. He's born in 1924. By 1929, they're in Arizona and he dies. My great grandfather, Lehigh Harris,
Oh
dies.
my,
So she's left 1929. I mean, you're thinking history right here,
yeah. Oh,
with five young children. And I can't find them on the 1930 census.
mm,
So I want to ask her, where were you? Quite honestly, and I've done the timeline, and I've, kind of, they were in Arizona, and I think they were in there till about December, and then they kind of drift back to where they were from in Idaho, but I can't find them on the 1930 census. So I've
wow.
told all my students, if you can find them, steak dinner to you, but it's I just think they were missed, and I think lots of
Yeah.
people were missed on the 1930 census. They were in transit. There was lots of
Yes.
things happening.
Yeah.
But for her particularly, I don't know. I find strength in her story. I read about her. She loved to sing. I love to sing. There's just so many things about her story that speak to me, and she
Yeah.
was just so strong. I don't know if you want me to keep going, but I would also ask her, a lot about her feelings of losing her husband and then having to
Yes.
go to work, and my grandfather being growing up as a latchkey kid, and then his
Mhm.
older brother joining the military in 1932, even before World War II,
Wow.
stationed in the Philippines. Um, and then both my grandfather and his brother joining the war too. So she had three sons in the Philippines during World War II.
Wow.
And sadly, her eldest son, Richard, perished on the Shinyo Maru, which is a was a Japanese hell ship. But I get details about his life through
Mhm.
newspapers
Yes.
because he was writing Rose, he was writing his mom,
Mhm.
and the local newspaper has some of those letters. And
Wow.
so I think that, I don't know, I've thought a lot about her. I mean, there's so many ancestors that I'd love to meet, but I would just love to
Yeah.
talk to her. I would love to just kind of hear more about her life and, how she just persevered through
Yes.
all of those things, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway.
She was never remarried after your great grandfather died.
Never
Yep.
remarried after he died.
Yeah.
He died in, they married in 1911, had the five kids. Or he died in 1929. And yeah, she
Yeah.
never remarried, but so she went to work trying to
Yeah.
provide for her
Right.
kids.
Yeah. I
And yeah.
I think those stories, I have a great grandmother, are very similar. It amazes me their strength during that time period to
Yeah.
not remarry and raise the kids. It just is amazing to me.
Yeah, and she did reunite with some of her siblings. It's kind of a funny story, but they came out to Utah, and she was at a general conference for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day
Mhm,
Saints.
mhm.
They hold their general conference every 6 months or so, and was at the conference, and these two women came up to her, and they started talking to her because they looked like each other. And so
Yes.
I have a picture of the three of them together. They took a picture after they reunited, but she really didn't know who her parents were. She didn't know a whole lot about them because she came to the US
Yeah.
at 4 and she was the youngest, and but she was able to reunite with two of her sisters and a brother.
That's
Yeah.
amazing.
So kind of neat. So she had kind of that family and her adopted family too,
Mhm.
but her adopted parents died, I think, right before her husband died too. So
Ugh,
lots of loss, lots of heartache,
yeah.
kind of hard stuff.
And she was the only one of the 12 or 13 that came over.
Hmm.
That just blows
She
my
was the
mind.
only one that came over as a child, but
Mhm.
then, like I said, her two sisters and her brother came over later as,
Yeah.
as adults, as young adults. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's kind of
I
crazy.
I think that's the thing for me that I love about family history is that you do when you're really into it like that, you do have those people in your line that you just have a connection to. You can't explain it
Yeah.
really, it just you just feel it in your heart. You've got that connection. That was a great story.
Yeah.
Oh, so I'm gonna make you tell me another one because that one was
Oh
so
boy.
good. So tell me a story that's just, one that maybe it's surprising or it's a favorite
Oh,
story that you have.
I don't know about favorite, but surprising for sure. If you want to hear, so on I mentioned my dad's side, they're all Italian, so of course, and Sicilian too to boot. So there's a little bit of mafia in there.
Oh,
So there's a few mafia stories. So my grandfather, they came from a little town in Tropeto, Sicily, moved to St. Louis, Missouri, and then eventually out to San Pedro, California. And San Pedro, there's a huge community of Italians. There's like
mhm,
San Pedro Fish Market
yeah.
that my, dad's cousins own, and it's really, and I grew up in California around all that. But anyway, I loved to hear the stories of my grandfather when he was growing up because he would talk about there was a guy in the neighborhood who would pile all the kids in the car, and so he was born in 1915.
Okay.
And so as a child, you had prohibition and things like that.
Hmm. Sure.
So a guy in the neighborhood would pile them all into the car and take them all for an ice cream. He'd run all the kids, to the store for an ice cream. And he said, I didn't know or realize until later he was running booze. And so he would intentionally put all the neighborhood kids in the car, take them for an ice cream because he didn't want the cops to see that the car was riding low. But he was running booze. So that's just
This
one of many.
this is so funny. So now I'm gonna have to go back because I've had quite a few people on the show. I am not exaggerating when I tell you somebody told me almost an exact
Oh,
story.
no way. I've never heard that from anybody else. That's so funny.
I'm gonna have to figure out who it was because I was like
Okay.
shocked when I heard that. It's like that's
Yeah.
crazy. Oh, that's
Yeah.
good. Small
Yeah,
world.
so it's just a funny, and he would talk about how he grew up with some of those people in the mafia, and I was kind of like, oh sure, Grandpa, sure.
Yeah.
And then I happened upon a book, several years ago that talks about the St. Louis Mafia, and he really lived with and among, was
Yeah.
never involved. We'll just put that
Yes.
out there, but
Yeah.
yeah, it was just kind of
Wow.
interesting.
So Suzanne, when did he come over from Italy
So
or from
it was
Sicily?
actually my great grandparents that came over from Italy. So my grandfather was born in the US in
Okay, he
Missouri in
was.
1915, and my grandmother in 1917. So both my grandparents on my dad's side came from all from Palermo area,
Yeah.
similar
Yes.
places there. But 1907, 1908,
Okay. Yeah.
that time period.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I actually had one of my his dad actually came a couple different times.
Oh,
So that's
okay.
typical of Italians,
Yes.
a little bit of back and forth.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Have you found I find that so my husband's background, Honert, very
hmm
German. And I found that too, found passport application and
yeah,
just that
yeah,
that kind of back and forth to see family members, um, in the old country.
yeah, yeah.
So last question I have for you, and I think this is perfect and it feeds right into your wheelhouse right now. Again, kind of thinking about those beginners, I think a lot of people feel very overwhelmed if this is
hmm
not something that they've been doing, and where do I even start? So what
Right.
kind of
Yeah.
advice do you have for people? Where should they get started? What are some top things to do?
I would say just obviously you start with yourself. I think it's important to kind of write your story, right?
Yes.
Um, but for me, like I said, like I got really into my Italian side because it was an interest to me. And so
Yeah.
we've got multiple lines of our family. I would say choose one. And
Yes.
then I would even say choose one ancestor that you want to learn more about
Yeah.
and kind of flesh out their life and their story.
Yeah.
Um, because I think it can be overwhelming if you try to go to all of your different lines. And I think
Yeah.
there's a time and place that you can, do more than one. But like I said, it took some time for me to kind of flesh out the story of my great grandmother Rose, and her journey from Switzerland, or my grandfather's story in St. Louis, and then they're
Yeah.
moved to California and things like that. So I would take it a little bit at a time. I don't think it has to be, all at once.
Yeah.
And like I said, there's so many great resources out there. But I'm gonna say start to timeline. Like
Yeah.
that's my kick lately is just kind
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
where were they born, and then where did they live, and then fill in those gaps in that timeline. I
Yeah.
don't know if that was you're looking for, if you're looking for specific
No,
sources or
that's perfect. I think that I love the idea of just focusing on one person. I think that's why they get overwhelmed
yeah,
when they start. They think they have to find everything, and I like to think that I'm never done. There's always
yeah.
something, even after doing it for 25 years, there's always something I'm going to find that I've got
There's
some homework.
always something to find. And I mean, I would say don't get so focused on that one person that you miss their family,
Right.
You've
Right.
got you've got to expand it out to the family to get the full story, right?
Sure.
Like
Yeah.
if I just focused on one person, I wouldn't, on just Rose, I wouldn't know that her siblings eventually came, and
Right.
who they married and what they did in their lives, and that all plays in because we're not just alone
Yeah.
in a silo. We've
Yeah.
got friends, neighbors, and
It's-
associates and things like that that really,
Absolutely.
really kind of tell that bigger, wider story of,
Yeah.
what our ancestors are doing.
Yeah, I think for sure. I think that, yeah, starting that small space, but you're right. I think you are missing a lot if you don't expand it, even like you said, beyond
Sure.
your family, doing those friends and neighbors. There's a lot to the story there, even for sure.
Yeah.
Well, Suzanne, I want to thank you for your time today. This has been a real treat for me, and I love your knowledge and passion for our space. It's evident just chatting with you. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. A lot of fun to talk to you.
Yeah. Well, until next time, friends, embrace the power of your family's untold tales and embark on a journey of discovery. Let the ink flow and the words dance as you weave together the threads of your ancestors' lives. Start writing your family stories today and let their voices echo through the generations to come at story.com. Have a great day, everyone. And that brings us to the end of this episode of the Family Treehouse, where we celebrate the power of storytelling and preserving our family legacies. Storied is more than just a platform for sharing stories. Dive into those historical records and newspapers, discovering the hidden gems that bring your ancestors to life. Add branches to your family tree, connecting the dots between generations. Thank you for joining us on this storytelling journey. Your stories matter, and through story, they have the power to resonate across time and touch the hearts of generations to come. Keep uncovering your family's history and keep the spirit of storytelling alive with Storied.